They told me the Harrow Shelf had broken better people than me. I heard it from the colony administrator when he handed me the survey contract, from the senior cartographer who'd mapped the lower terraces and quit on her third day, and from the shuttle pilot who dropped me on the landing pad with my gear and said cheerfully that he gave me a week before I called for extraction. 300 years of colonial occupation on Valdres IV, and not one survey team had completed a full documentation of the Harrow Shelf. The altitude alone was enough. The plateau sat at 4,000 meters, above the cloud deck, in permanent wind. The gales came from the west off the Drenath Range and hit the plaza stones with a sound like the planet itself was clearing its throat. Every morning, every afternoon, every night, I was contracted to map the carved plaza surrounding the gate. Not the gate itself. Nobody mapped the gate. That was understood without being stated, the way certain things are understood on old colony worlds. You don't touch the primary feature, you document the periphery, you write your report, and you go home. The gate was 30 meters of smooth gray stone set into the plateau's eastern cliff face. It had been there when the first colonial survey ship landed 3 centuries ago, long before any human footprint on this world. The engineers who came after tried to date it. Their instruments gave readings they called implausible, and then, quietly, stopped publishing. The diplomatic corps sent 2 delegations to stand before it with translation arrays and broadcast standard first contact protocols. Silence. A religious expedition installed prayer markers along its base and held 7 days of ceremony. Nothing. A military engineering team drilled anchor points into the cliff face above it, rigged a mechanical spreader bar, and applied 18 tons of lateral force to the lock rings carved around its center seam. The rings didn't flex. The drill bits wore smooth. The team left their equipment bolted to the cliff and put in for reassignment. The lock rings were the gate's only ornamentation, 7 concentric bands carved in shallow relief, each nested inside the next, running from the outer edge to the central seam. In 300 years, no one had seen them move. In the survey photographs, they looked like decoration. I had studied those photographs for 2 weeks before taking the contract, and I had come to think they looked less like decoration and more like mechanism, like the face of something that was still deciding. I set up my equipment on the 3rd day and spent the 4th and 5th documenting the plaza stones. The carvings there were different from the gate's rings, looser, older in feel, pictographic rather than geometric. I photographed and logged and noted, and tried not to look at the gate more than I had to, because looking at it too long gave me the particular feeling of being watched by something that wasn't watching you yet, but could, at any moment, decide to. The storm came on the morning of the 6th day. I had checked the weather relays the night before. They showed nothing. The colony's meteorological network on Valdres IV was adequate for the lowland settlements, adequate for the coastal stations, and nearly useless at altitude. The storm came off the Drenath Range in 2 hours, stacked to 8,000 meters, and hit the Harrow Shelf before I had finished breakfast. My tent stayed staked. The equipment cases were clipped to anchor lines I'd run along the survey grid. The support technician who'd arrived on day 4 to help with the photogrammetry rig took one look at the color of the sky and called extraction. His shuttle came in sideways and barely made it off the pad. The colony's secondary survey team, who had been working the lower terraces and who I had met twice over the radio, radioed me at 0940 to say they were pulling back to the valley station and strongly recommended I do the same. I told them I'd call if I needed anything. The gale was not violent in the way that a battlefield is violent. It was violent the way geological time is violent, immense, patient, indifferent to the distinction between you and the stone beside you. I anchored myself to the survey line with a clip harness and walked the plaza stones checking instrument housings. The wind shear changed direction every 40 minutes, and in the shifts between directions, there were brief, strange pockets of near silence. Not quiet exactly, but a relative absence, the way a roar sounds like silence after something louder than a roar. I was in one of those pockets, mid-afternoon, standing about 6 meters from the gate's base, when I noticed the outermost lock ring had moved. It had rotated perhaps 4 degrees, clockwise. The carved relief along its edge had shifted just enough that a detail I had memorized, a forked line at what I had logged as the ring's 9 o'clock position, now sat at roughly 9:15. I stood very still. I was not afraid. That surprised me later, when I tried to explain it to the colony administrator. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of solving a problem you hadn't consciously been working on. A click of recognition. Not in the mind exactly, but in the sternum. The second ring moved while I was watching it. Slower than the first, perhaps 2 degrees. The stone made no sound that carried over the wind. It simply moved the way a well-machined part moves when the mechanism it belongs to has finally decided to engage. By the time the third ring completed its first rotation, I had stopped backing away. I don't remember making that decision. I remember that I had taken 3 steps backward after the second ring moved, and that at some point I was no longer moving backward, and that the wind had dropped again into one of its pauses, and that the pause held longer than any previous one. The 4th and 5th rings moved together. The 6th followed, then the 7th, the innermost, completing the set. All 7 now aligned along a common axis that ran from the bottom of the gate to its crown, a straight vertical line of meeting edges that had not existed in 300 years. The central seam began to part. It separated slowly, the way a wound opens rather than the way a door opens, not hinging, not sliding, but the stone itself drawing apart along the seam's line, revealing first a hairline, then a millimeter, then a centimeter of what was behind it. The light that came through was pale and silver white, sourceless, the kind of light that doesn't have a direction because it doesn't cast shadows. It filled the gap evenly. I stood 6 meters away with my hands at my sides and the wind pulling at my jacket, and watched it open. When the gap was perhaps 30 centimeters wide, the gate spoke. Not loudly, not in any language I had catalogued in the Valdres Force Survey database, but the words arrived fully formed in the way that very old things sometimes communicate, not through the ear exactly, but as if the meaning were already somewhere inside you, and the sound was only the signal that told you to find it. You are the last threshold. 5 words. Steady as the plateau under my boots. No ceremony in them, no warmth, no apology for the 3 centuries of silence, just the declaration, clean and final, as though it were simply clarifying something that had always been true and was only now being said aloud. I understood it immediately, not as a title, not as an honor, as a description. Every team that had come to this gate had come with something in their hands. Force, authority, credentials, religious observance, engineering capability. They had approached it the way you approach a problem to be solved, and the gate had registered them the way a lock registers the wrong key, fully, precisely, and with complete indifference. None of them had been wrong, exactly. They had simply not been what the gate was preserving itself for. It wasn't waiting for a queen, or a bloodline, or a password locked in some lost codex. It was waiting for whoever was left standing when everything else had gone. Whoever stood at the line and didn't cross back. The threshold is not the door. The threshold is the person who refuses to be moved by the storm, not because they are brave or titled or chosen, but because they simply are not the kind of person who leaves. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the gate hadn't already said better in 5 words. The silver-white light held steady in the gap. The 7 rings sat motionless in their unlocked alignment. The wind returned, low and even, running across the plaza stones the way it always did, indifferent to what had just happened. I stood at the Harrow Shelf in the last hour of afternoon and understood that I had not been sent here to map a door. I had been sent here because the door was finished waiting,